The moon hung like a pale coin in the starless sky, casting its cold light over the endless stretch of black ocean. The sea warden rocked gently in the night, her sails barely stirring in the dead calm. Captain Elias Greaves stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the horizon, though there was nothing to see but the murky, distant line where sky and sea blurred together. "Quiet tonight," muttered First Mate Donnelly, breaking the silence. He was a grizzled sailor, his skin as rough as the ropes he worked with. Too quiet, if you ask me. Greaves didn't respond, but he felt it too. There was something wrong with the air tonight, something thick and oppressive that pressed down on the crew like a weight. It was the kind of silence that made a man feel watched, though by what, he couldn't say. As if on cue, a low, distant moan carried across the water. Greaves stiffened, his hand tightening on the wheel. It wasn't the wind. There was none. It wasn't the creaking of the ship either. No, this sound was human. A cry of despair, muffled by the expanse of the sea. "You hear that?" Donnelly asked, his voice tight. "Aye," Greaves muttered. "I heard it." The sound came again, a mournful wail that sent a chill down the captain's spine. It seemed to rise from the depths of the ocean itself, something ancient and forgotten calling out for attention. Greaves turned to his lookout, perched in the crow's nest above. "See anything, Connors?" For a long moment, Connors didn't answer. Then, slowly, he called down in a voice that wavered like a flame in the wind. "Something ahead, Captain. A ship, I think." A ship? There hadn't been another vessel sighted in days, and no ship was due to pass in these waters. Greaves squinted into the distance, but the fog had thickened, clinging to the sea like a shroud. Still, there was something there. A dark shape, barely visible through the mist, moving toward them with unnatural speed. "What in blazes?" Donnelly whispered. The ship came closer, emerging from the fog like a nightmare rising from the depths. Its silhouette was ancient, its hull blackened and weather-beaten, as if it had been adrift for centuries. The sails hung in tatters, yet the ship moved with purpose, cutting through the water without a breeze to guide it. No lanterns flickered on its deck, no sound of life echoed from within. "Abandoned ship?" one of the younger sailors called nervously from the deck below. Greaves ignored him, his eyes fixed on the ghostly vessel that now loomed dangerously close. Donnelly leaned in. "Captain, that ship. There's no one aboard." Greaves's blood ran cold as he realized Donnelly was right. No crew manned the deck, no captain stood at its helm. It drifted silently, as if guided by some invisible force, a cursed shadow of a ship. Just as Greaves opened his mouth to give an order, the cry came again. This time it was louder, agonizing like the death wail of a man who'd suffered long at sea. It seemed to come from the ship itself, as though the very boards of the vessel screamed in torment. "What kind of ship is that?" Connors shouted from above. "The kind we should stay far away from," Donnelly answered, his voice low. But the ghost ship wasn't giving them a choice. Without warning, the fog surged forward, thick and heavy, swallowing the sea warden in an icy grip. The air turned frigid, and the hairs on the back of Greaves's neck stood up as the temperature plummeted. He could no longer see the cursed vessel, but he could feel it, close enough to touch. "Bring her about!" Greaves barked, his voice sharp with urgency. The crew scrambled to obey, but the wheel wouldn't turn. It was as if the ship itself had been locked in place, held fast by the unseen force that now encircled them. "We're trapped, Captain," Donnelly cried, his eyes wide with fear. "It's got us!" Greaves clenched his jaw. The ghostly wails echoed louder, reverberating through the bones of the ship, through the bones of the men themselves. And in the heart of the fog, something shifted, something that wasn't alive, but wasn't dead either. The cursed ship was waiting. The fog clung to the sea warden like a shroud, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the ship whole. The cold was unnatural, biting into the flesh of the crew as they stumbled about, trying to make sense of the strange forces that had gripped them. The ghost ship had vanished from view, but its presence lingered, felt more than seen. Captain Greaves stood motionless at the helm, his breath coming in ragged clouds of mist. His mind churned, grappling with what he had just witnessed. He could still hear the faint cry of the unseen, a tortured voice carried by the wind. "I don't like this, Captain," Donnelly muttered, standing by his side. His hands gripped the rail so tightly his knuckles were white. "It's like the sea itself wants us gone." Greaves didn't respond. His attention was drawn to something else, the faintest whisper on the wind, as if a voice were trying to reach him through the fog. It was too quiet to make out, a barely audible murmur, but it was there, and it was getting closer. The ship creaked beneath their feet, groaning like a wounded animal. Every plank seemed to shudder, as though the vessel itself sensed the danger lurking in the mist. The crew huddled together on the deck, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. None of them dared speak, but the fear in the air was palpable. Then came the whisper again, clearer this time. A disembodied voice so soft it barely seemed real. "Turn back." Greaves froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He glanced at Donnelly, whose face had drained of all color. "Did you hear that?" Greaves asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Donnelly nodded, eyes wide with disbelief. I heard it." Before they could react, the fog shifted. Shadows swirled in the mist, moving like ghosts just beyond the edge of their vision. Greaves squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes, but every time he focused, they seemed to disappear, slipping back into the dense cloud that surrounded them. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. "Turn back, while you still can." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the ship, filling the air with a low, mournful tone. Greaves's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to listen, but the words remained maddeningly elusive, slipping away just as he thought he could grasp them. From below, a sharp scream pierced the air. One of the younger deckhands, Ellis, stumbled backward, eyes wild with terror. "I saw something," he cried, pointing into the fog. "It was right there, watching us." Greaves and Donnelly exchanged a grim look. The crew was on edge and panic was setting in. If they didn't take control of the situation soon, things could spiral out of hand. "There's nothing there," Donnelly barked, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just the fog playing tricks on your mind." But Greaves wasn't so sure. He too had seen something, a flash of movement in the mist, a shadow that didn't belong. And the whispers, those voices were not the product of fear. They were a warning. "Steady, men," Greaves called, forcing authority into his voice. "Keep your heads about you." But as the words left his mouth, another sound filled the air, a groaning like the death rattle of something immense and unseen. The ship shuddered violently, the deck tilting beneath their feet as though it were being pushed by a great force. "Captain," Connors shouted from above. "We've drifted off course. I can't see anything up ahead." Greaves cursed under his breath. The fog was thickening, swallowing everything in its path. The sea, once calm, had begun to churn beneath them, waves crashing against the hull as if trying to pull them down. Suddenly, the air grew colder still, freezing the breath in their throats. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on them from all sides. And then, from the heart of the fog, came a new sound, the faint tolling of a bell. Low and hollow, its mournful chime echoed across the water. Donnelly's eyes widened with dread. "That's no ship's bell." Greaves felt a chill deeper than the cold air settle into his bones. The fog began to part just enough for them to see through to the other side. There, rising from the mist like a specter of the sea, was the ghost ship. Its weathered hull gleamed in the moonlight, and its tattered sails flapped silently in the non-existent wind, and standing on its deck were figures, shadowy, twisted forms, their faces obscured by the darkness, watching, waiting. The sea warden bobbed lifelessly in the water, its crew frozen by the sight before them. The ghost ship loomed mere yards away, an ancient, crumbling hulk barely held together by time and something far more sinister. It swayed gently, though there was no wind to move it. The fog pressed close around both vessels, trapping them in a pocket of chilling stillness. "Captain, what do we do?" Donnelly asked, his voice a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might wake the dead. Greaves stared at the ghost ship, heart pounding in his chest. The figures on its deck had not moved, but their presence was palpable, silent, watching, and waiting. The ship seemed to beckon them closer, its very existence a question that demanded an answer. "Lower the longboat," Greaves ordered, his voice steady despite the dread curling in his gut. "Are you mad?" Donnelly snapped, stepping closer to the captain. "You're thinking of going aboard that thing? Whatever's on there, it's not of this world." Greaves tore his eyes away from the phantom vessel, locking his gaze with Donnelly's. "Whatever that ship is, it's not going to let us go until we know what we're dealing with. We don't have a choice." Donnelly looked like he wanted to argue, but the grim truth was undeniable. They were trapped, with no way forward and no way back. He gave a resigned nod, motioning to the men. "You heard the captain. Prepare the boat." A handful of sailors, pale-faced and trembling, scrambled to obey. The longboat was lowered into the water with agonizing slowness, the sound of creaking wood seeming unnaturally loud in the eerie silence that surrounded them. Greaves, Donnelly, and two other crewmen climbed down the ladder, the sea beneath them unnervingly still. As they rowed closer to the ghost ship, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Their breath formed clouds of vapor in the freezing air, and a thick, foul stench wafted from the vessel, a stench of rot and decay, as though the ship had been moldering for centuries at the bottom of the ocean. No one spoke as they approached. The only sound was the soft splash of oars cutting through the inky black water. The ghost ship loomed larger now, its once majestic hull scarred and pitted with age, barnacles clinging to its sides like parasites. The sails hung in tatters, dark stains marring the canvas, stains that looked far too much like blood. With a creaking groan, the longboat bumped against the hull of the ghost ship. Greaves looked up, his pulse quickening. A rope ladder, old and frayed, hung down the side as if inviting them aboard. "God help us," muttered one of the sailors, Ellis, his face pale with fear. Greaves grabbed the ladder, feeling the rough, brittle texture beneath his fingers. we're going up. Stay close and keep your wits about you." One by one they climbed, their movements slow and deliberate. The ghost ship felt like a living thing beneath Greaves's hands, its wood damp and cold as though it had been cut from the bones of something long dead. He swung his legs over the railing and stepped onto the deck, his boots echoing in the unnerving silence. The deck was a graveyard of broken planks, ropes that had rotted into limp, lifeless strands, and debris that seemed untouched for centuries. Yet, despite its decay, the ship felt disturbingly intact, like a corpse preserved in the depths of the sea. Donnelly and the others joined him, their faces taut with unease. They stood in a small cluster, taking in their surroundings, but the crewmen who had been watching them from the Sea Warden now seemed to have vanished, absorbed back into the fog. "Where are they?" Ellis whispered, his voice tight with fear. As if in answer, a low creak echoed from within the ship's dark interior. Greaves turned toward the sound, his heart pounding in his ears. A doorway yawned open at the far end of the deck, leading into the ship's black belly. "That's where we need to go," Greaves said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Every instinct told him to turn back, to get off the ship and leave whatever haunted it to rot in the depths of the ocean. But they were too far gone for that now. Something had drawn them here, something that demanded their attention. They moved cautiously toward the doorway, their steps muffled on the damp, decaying wood. The air grew colder still as they approached, thick with the stench of mildew and something far worse, something that reeked of death. Greaves hesitated at the threshold, his breath catching in his throat. The darkness beyond the door seemed alive, pulsing like a heartbeat, waiting to swallow them whole. He took a deep breath and stepped through. The shadows closed in, and behind him, the whispers began again, louder this time, and they were not alone. The darkness swallowed them whole. Greaves led the way down a narrow passage, the air thick with the smell of rot and stagnant water. His lantern cast a sickly yellow glow, barely illuminating the decaying walls around them. The ship seemed to moan beneath their feet, each step echoing through the hollow corridors like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living thing. Behind him, Donnelly, Ellis, and Briggs followed in tense silence. No one dared speak. The deeper they ventured into the ship, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. It was as though the very air resisted their presence, pushing back against their every breath. They emerged into what appeared to be the ship's main hold. The lantern's light flickered, casting long skeletal shadows over the scene. Crates, long since rotted, lay scattered across the floor, their contents spilled and forgotten. Tangled nets hung from the walls, frayed and crumbling, and the ceiling dripped with seawater, leaving dark stains across the warped wood. But it wasn't the state of the ship that held their attention. In the center of the room stood a row of figures, men, or at least what had once been men. They were dressed in the tattered remnants of sailors' garb, their flesh pale and translucent, as if they had been drained of life. Their eyes were hollow, vacant sockets that stared blindly ahead. Yet there was something alive about them, a flicker of movement in their frozen forms, as though they were trapped between life and death. Ellis gasped, stumbling backward. "Are they dead?" Donnelly said grimly. "Or they should be." Greaves stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. The figures were not just bodies, they were a crew. This had once been a living ship with living men aboard. Now it was a graveyard, and these sailors were its cursed keepers. One of the figures twitched, a faint jerking movement that sent a jolt of fear through Greaves. He raised his lantern higher, its light falling on the man's face, or what was left of it. His skin was stretched tight over bone, his lips drawn back in a twisted rictus. But it was his eyes, or the empty sockets where eyes should have been, that froze Greaves in place. They were moving, slowly, as if waking from a long, terrible sleep. "Captain, we need to get out of here," Briggs whispered, his voice shaking. "This place, it's not right." Greaves knew he was right, but something held him in place. These men, they were not just dead sailors. They were victims of something far worse. One of the figures moved again, this time a full step forward. His head jerked unnaturally to the side, and from his hollow mouth came a sound, a ragged, wheezing breath like the last gasp of a drowning man. "Help! Us!" The voice was a rasp, barely more than a whisper, but it echoed through the hold like thunder. Donnelly took a step back, his face ashen. What in God's name? The other figures began to stir now, one by one, their limbs moving with stiff, unnatural motions. Their heads turned toward Greaves and his men, their eyeless faces filled with a silent, agonizing plea. "They're trapped," Greaves said, his voice thick with dread. "They're caught in some kind of curse." As if in answer, one of the sailors staggered forward, his arms outstretched. His fingers, long and bony, twitched as if reaching for something unseen. "We were men," the sailor croaked, his voice like the grinding of stone. "We sailed, like you, and now we are nothing." The air around them grew colder, and the ship creaked as if in pain. The lantern light flickered again, threatening to go out, plunging them into total darkness. The cursed crew moved closer, their broken bodies shuffling with tortured slowness. "We were doomed," another one rasped, "doomed to sail forever." Greaves felt the weight of their words settle over him like a leaden cloak. This wasn't just a shipwreck or a haunting. These men were caught in an endless nightmare, forced to relive their final moments over and over, their souls bound to the ship that had become their prison. "They want to make us like them," Ellis whispered, his voice trembling. "They're trying to pull us into their curse." Greaves knew it was true. The ghost ship had lured them here, its cursed crew desperate for release. But the release they sought wasn't salvation. It was to drag others into their torment. "We need to leave," Donnelly hissed. "Now!" Before Greaves could respond, a horrible groan echoed through the hold. The cursed sailors moved faster now, their jerky movements becoming frantic, their arms reaching out with a terrifying desperation. "They're trying to take us," Briggs cried, turning to run. But as the crew turned to flee, the doorway— "This way!" Donnelly shouted suddenly, pointing toward a narrow hatch in the far corner of the hold. It was half hidden beneath a collapsed beam and debris, barely noticeable in the dim light. Without hesitation, they bolted for it, their boots echoing across the rotting wood. Greaves dropped to his knees, tearing at the debris with frantic hands. Behind them, the cursed sailors moved faster now, their broken bodies twitching and jerking as they advanced. They moaned softly, their hollow voices pleading for an end to their suffering. "Help us! Free us! Join us!" Briggs and Ellis heaved the beam aside, the rotten wood crumbling beneath their hands. The hatch swung open with a loud creak. revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the bowels of the ship. It was dark, the stairs slick with something wet and foul-smelling, but it was their only hope. "Go!" Greaves barked, pushing Ellis and Briggs ahead of him. Donnelly followed close behind, and Greaves was the last to descend, casting one last glance at the cursed crew before disappearing into the darkness below. The air grew colder as they descended, the oppressive weight of the ship bearing down on them. The moans of the crew faded, replaced by the eerie creaking of the ship itself, as if it were groaning under the weight of its own curse. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling around their feet, and the smell of mildew and decay grew stronger. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves in what appeared to be the lower hold, a dark, cramped space filled with rotting barrels and crates. The walls were slick with moisture, the wood blackened and swollen from centuries of being trapped in the depths of the sea. The lantern's flickering light barely pierced the gloom. "What now?" Ellis gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Greaves wiped sweat from his brow, his mind racing. They had managed to escape the cursed crew, but the ship itself still had them trapped. The ghost ship was no ordinary vessel. It was a living nightmare, a floating prison that had lured them in and refused to let them go. "There has to be another way out," Greaves muttered, scanning the cramped hold. But the ship seemed to close in around them, its wooden ribs groaning like the bones of a dead creature. "Search for anything, an opening, a hatch, anything," Donnelly cursed under his breath as he began tearing through the crates, his movements frantic. The others followed suit, their hands shaking as they worked. The ship seemed to watch them, its malevolent presence pressing down like a vice. Every creak, every whisper in the dark felt like the ship tightening its grip, waiting to claim them. Suddenly, Briggs froze. "Do you hear that?" They all stopped, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of dripping water and their own labored breathing. But then, faintly, there came a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping. It was distant, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. It was the sound of a heartbeat. "The ship," Donnelly whispered. "It's alive." Greaves's blood ran cold. He had felt it from the moment they boarded, the way the ship seemed to breathe, to move with purpose. Now it was clear. The ship wasn't just cursed, it was a living entity, feeding off the souls trapped within it. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, and the walls began to shake. The barrels rattled and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. The heartbeat of the ship was quickening, as if it sensed their fear, their desperation. It was hungry. "We have to go," Greaves shouted, grabbing the lantern and motioning for the others to follow. But as they turned to flee, the floor beneath them shifted violently, sending them sprawling across the wet wood. The ship was waking up, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The ship groaned like a wounded beast, its wooden bones creaking as if they would splinter apart at any moment. Greaves struggled to his feet, the lantern flickering in his hand as the floor beneath them pitched violently. Water sloshed across the lower hold, flooding their boots and carrying the stench of decay. The sound of the ship's heartbeat reverberated through the walls, growing louder and faster with every passing second. "Up!" Donnelly shouted, pulling Ellis to his feet. "We have to get back on deck." But before they could move, a door on the far side of the hold, one Greaves hadn't noticed before, creaked open. A cold, unnatural wind blew through the opening, sending shivers down their spines. The heartbeat slowed, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to suffocate the air around them. From the darkness beyond the door, a figure emerged. At first, it was hard to tell if it was human or something else entirely. It was tall and gaunt, its flesh pale and stretched taut over its bones. The tattered remains of a captain's coat hung from its skeletal frame, the once proud gold buttons tarnished and blackened with age. Its eyes, sunk in hollow pits, glowed faintly with a sickly blue light. Captain Greaves stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew at once who this was. The captain of the ghost ship. The cursed figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was fighting against some invisible weight. When it spoke, its voice was a rasping whisper, carried on the chill wind that filled the hold. "You have trespassed," the captain said, his words stretching like the ship's creaking timbers. "You have come to claim what is not yours." Greaves took a step back, his throat dry. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, but no one dared speak. The cursed captain's presence filled the hold, an overwhelming aura of death and despair. "We didn't come to claim anything," Greaves said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We were drawn here. We had no choice." The captain's hollow gaze settled on Greaves, unblinking and cold. "No choice," he rasped. "There is always a choice, but once you set foot on my ship, there is no turning back." Greaves's pulse quickened. "What do you want?" The cursed captain tilted his head, the faintest hint of a grin pulling at his skeletal lips. "I offer you a bargain, as it was once offered to me." The crew exchanged nervous glances, but Greaves didn't waver. He had to know. "What kind of bargain?" The captain's voice dropped to a whisper, so low that Greaves had to strain to hear. "Free me from this curse," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Release my soul from this eternal prison, and in exchange, I will let you and your men live." Greaves felt his stomach churn. The thought of making a deal with this cursed creature went against every instinct he had, but he knew there was no other way out. The ship was alive, feeding on them, and unless they did something, they would all be consumed by its curse. "How do we free you?" Greaves asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The cursed captain's grin widened, a grotesque mockery of joy. "Take my place," he rasped. "One of you must stay. One of you must become the captain of this ship, bound to sail the seas for eternity, as I have." The weight of the offer settled over the crew like a death sentence. Ellis shook his head, backing away in horror. No, we can't." Briggs turned to Greaves, panic in his eyes. "Captain, there has to be another way." But Greaves knew there wasn't. The ship wouldn't let them go, not all of them. He looked at the cursed captain, then back at his crew. Donnelly, who had been with him for years. Ellis, barely a man, his life still ahead of him. Briggs, a loyal sailor who had a family waiting for him back home. Greaves's heart sank. He knew what had to be done. "I'll stay," Greaves said, the words heavy on his tongue. "No, Captain!" Donnelly grabbed his arm, shaking his head violently. "You can't do this!" Greaves pulled free of Donnelly's grip, his expression grim but resolute. "There's no other choice. If I don't, we're all dead. Someone has to end this." The cursed captain's hollow eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. "So be it," he whispered. "Your men will live, but you will sail the seas forever." Greaves felt the ship tremble beneath him, as if acknowledging his decision. The cursed crew was waiting, their hollow faces twisted with the agony of eternal life, but they would not claim his men. Donnelly, Ellis, and Briggs stood frozen, unable to stop what was happening. Greaves turned to them, his heart breaking at the sight of their despair. "Go," he said softly. "Get off this ship and don't look back." Tears welled in Ellis's eyes as he nodded, unable to speak. Donnelly's jaw was clenched tight, fury and grief warring in his expression. Greaves stepped toward the cursed captain, feeling the weight of the bargain settle over him. The captain reached out, placing a cold, skeletal hand on Greaves's shoulder. "The ship is yours now," the captain whispered, his voice like the wind. "Welcome to eternity." As Greaves's vision blurred and the ship groaned around him, he knew he had saved his men, but his soul would be lost forever. The Sea Warden drifted away, disappearing into the mist, leaving Captain Greaves alone on the cursed ship to sail the endless seas, bound to a fate worse than death.